We now sing our second hymn, King of Glory. As tempting as it is to continue in Romans, I feel the Lord asked me to speak on Matthew. However, I just want to share with you those two verses in Romans, because for me, they transformed my life. It was verses 9 and 10. It made me realize, and I'm going to read them to you again in a minute, just in case you haven't got a Bible in front of you. It made me realize that I was saved through grace, when it all of a sudden went from my head to my heart. And the verses go like this: if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. Paul's very clear there about how we are saved. It's by believing in what Jesus has done for us. It's that those verses have had such a profound effect on so many Christians through the years that before I move on to Matthew, I just thought, I just want to underline that. So, Matthew's is a very well-known reading that we had where Jesus let's just have a little context review of what's been happening in the life of Jesus as we look at Matthew. Jesus has heard that his cousin has been beheaded, and he says to the disciples, come on, let's get away, let's go and find some quietness to process this, to work this through together. And so they go off in a boat, and as they're going off in the boat over the lake, the crowds see them and the crowds meet them the other side of the lake, and Jesus has compassion on them. He's longing for some peace to process, but his compassion for the crowd is greater than his sort of like desire for his own well-being, as it were. And so he preaches and he feeds 5,000 men and some women and some children as well. And there's 12 baskets left over. And then he immediately, this reading says, puts the disciples into the boat and sends them off. Why? So that he can find some time of solitude by himself with the Father. He didn't ignore the need for solitude with the Father. He found the time, but his compassion for the crowd meant that he had to rejig his diary by a few hours or whatever, and then he sent them onto the boat ahead of him as he had solitude. And the disciples find themselves in a boat against the wind and the tide, and they're rowing, and they're still rowing, and it's nearly dawn. They must have been thinking, why has he sent us in a boat? Didn't he realize the storm was coming? I mean, why are we here? Why are we in this particular situation? We find ourselves in a difficult situation because we are obedient to Jesus. We get in a boat, we start rowing, and life's tough. Have you ever found life tough? It is sometimes, isn't it? That doesn't mean that you've been disobedient. Here are the disciples finding life tough. And they were totally obedient to Jesus. He's the one who put them in the boat and said, on you go. And they're finding it really tough. So if you're finding life tough at the moment, that doesn't mean you've been disobedient. But good news is Jesus comes walking towards you. He comes to find you. He comes and finds you in your difficult situation. And we can sometimes be like the disciples, and we can be fearful. We can be fearful of the presence of God. We may not even understand that what we are experiencing is the presence of God. And it can be very frightening. These guys have been hanging out with Jesus for a number of years now, and they don't recognize him. They go, oh my goodness, it's a ghost. Lord, give us the gift of discernment that we recognize you when we need to. Please. There's Jesus walking on the water. They're going, that's really weird. People don't walk on water. So they came to the natural conclusion, in their mind, this must be a ghost. But it's not, it's Jesus. Don't worry, Jesus says. I know you're in a difficult position, you've been having a tough night, and you've been rowing there against the wind and everything, but it's me. That doesn't seem to settle them too much. Peter shouts out, well, if it is you, what a funny thing to say. If it is you, they've just heard the voice of Jesus, heard the voice of God, and they still say, if it is you, Lord, give us discernment that we would recognize your voice when you speak to us quite plainly. If it is you. Then Peter says a really bizarre thing, doesn't he? I mean, he's a fisherman. He understands the circumstances of where he finds himself. This is not an unusual predicament. He finds himself in a boat that's in a bit of a stormy weather. And he says, if it's you, call me to get out into the water. Why? Why would you say that? It seems like a very bizarre thing to say, doesn't it? I have no answers. You'll have to ask Peter when we see him in heaven. Why did you say that? But anyway, it leads on to a very interesting point, because there comes a point when Jesus says, come. Now, Peter's put himself in a really awkward position, because he said, if it's you, tell me to come. And Jesus has called him out on it. And he says, well, come on then. Jesus didn't put Peter into this predicament. Peter put himself into this predicament. Jesus didn't say, I'm going to make you have a really tough moment now. It was Peter who said, if it is you, call me and I'll come. Come. Now, Peter, as I say, has put himself in a really difficult position because he's probably looking at the water going, that was a daft thing that I've just done there. What was I thinking? And so he's looking at Jesus, who said, come. He's looking at the water, and he's got a choice to make, isn't he, now? Well, he said, come. He's walking on the water. Have any of you walked on water? I mean, I know I've shared this with you before that I have. Admittedly, it was iced over in Finland. And as I walked across there, me and Matthew, we were walking across, we were walking on water. Only to see a bloke cycling, which kind of like ruined the whole sort of like thing, really. So we were walking on water. And I only know of one other person who has deliberately tried to walk on water, and that's my son. He was out with his grandparents, and his ball had gone into a boating lake, and he was trying to get it. They were trying to get it back with sticks, and Luke had just had the night before or something, this reading. So he thought, I'll walk on the water, get the ball, come back. I mean, that's very logical for a 5-year-old, isn't it? I'll walk on the water, get the ball, walk back. Jesus did it. I've got to be like Jesus. I'll do it as well. So he was in a very similar situation to Peter, apart from he probably had more faith than Peter, to be honest. Because he just went, well, I'll just go and get the ball. And then the words he used to describe what happened next were this. He said, Daddy, the water let me in. Which I thought was very kind of the water as Liz went off to change his trousers. So here's Peter going, I wonder if the water will let me in, or whether I'll be like Jesus, just walking on the top. Now, for us, it seems like an incredible thing, but hold on a minute. What has Peter seen Jesus just do? He's just seen the feeding of the 5,000. So his faith levels are, well, he does do extraordinary things and he's walking on the water. He's seen Jairus, his daughter, raised from the dead. He's seen miracles. And now his faith is about to be stretched again. For some of us, praying for somebody to be healed is a stretch in our faith. For others, getting out of a boat is the stretch that Jesus takes to the next level. This is where Peter's at. And to his credit, he gets out of the boat and he starts walking. He starts walking towards Jesus. And he's probably thinking, I'm walking on the water. Guys, look at me. Walking on the water. And as he's walking towards Jesus, the Bible reading says that he became aware of the elements around him. And what did he scream out? He didn't scream out, Jesus, you've tricked me. He said, Jesus, save me. Jesus, save me. He doesn't blame it on Jesus. He takes everything upon himself and he calls out to Jesus and says, save me. Save me. Save me. And Jesus does. And Jesus, well, you can read it in two ways. Does Jesus reprimand Peter, or does he compliment him when he says, you of little faith? Because if Jesus says to me, you of little faith, I'm thinking mustard seed. What are you thinking? Do you see it as a rebuke? Or do you see it as Jesus saying, you've got little faith? And that's where it starts. You of little faith. But then he does challenge him and say, why did you doubt? You were doing so well. Why did you doubt? And so we can go on with faith, we can keep on walking. And as we saw from the Romans reading, it's faith that saves us. It's faith that brings us into salvation. It's faith that helps us to be disciples. So even with a little faith, we keep on walking. And that question, why did you doubt, is an interesting question for us to think about. Why did he doubt? It's because he started to look at what was around him rather than looking at Jesus. And so often we can start to look around what's around us rather than looking at Jesus. So I think it's really important for us to just, how's that old song go? Keep your eyes upon Jesus. Keep your eyes upon Jesus. It's very tempting sometimes to look at the culture, the world around us, the circumstances in what we find ourselves, the situations we find ourselves in. Keep our eyes on Jesus. Peter was in a very difficult situation, in a boat that was seemingly going nowhere, but yet when Jesus said come, he came and started heading towards Jesus. If he'd kept his eyes on Jesus, the story would have been different. So Lord, we pray that when we're tempted to take our eyes off you and be influenced by the things around us rather than by you and your words and your desires for us, Lord, we pray, help us to lift our eyes. Help us to lift our eyes and gaze upon you. Help us to lift our eyes and listen to you. Because you are the one who saves us.